Hello, my name is Anastasia Izmaylova, and in my presentation today I will discuss a multiple case study that explored individual learners' experiences in a telecollaboration. There has been a lot of research on intercultural telecollaboration and its potential effects on language learners. It has been shown to promote intercultural competence development, improve learners' language skills, and increase motivation and interest in language learning. While these are certainly important outcomes, it is also worthwhile to look at the effects of telecollaboration on an individual level and explore how different backgrounds and attitudes affect learners' experiences and learning as a result of the exchange. In this presentation, I will discuss a part of a larger study on telecollaboration, where one of the research questions was about individual learners' experiences. In this broad question, I explored the effects of prior experiences, cultural backgrounds, and pre-telecollaboration intercultural competence skills on students' learning and engagement in the exchange. The telecollaboration took place between students in a fourth semester Spanish course at a large Midwestern university and students in an English as a foreign language course at a university in Bogotá, Colombia. Over the course of 8 weeks, students exchanged information about their home cultures on a variety of topics. Each week, they made one post in their native language about their own culture and commented on 2 posts by their target language and cultural counterparts. In addition, the US class had weekly discussions about each topic. For this multiple case study, I chose 3 students as focal participants. The basis for choosing these 3 was their different cultural identities. One of them was a heritage learner, one demonstrated a transnational identity, and another one was monocultural. Using interpretive qualitative analysis, I used these participants' portfolios and pre- and post-exchange questionnaire responses, as well as pre- and post-exchange interviews as my data points. In my analysis, I relied on models and conceptualizations of intercultural competence discussed by Byram, Bennett, and Cramsch. While these models and theories have their differences, all 3 share a similar understanding of some of the main components of intercultural competence. They essentially view it as mediating between cultures and being able to shift one's frame of reference, which requires an understanding of one's own culture and being able to interpret foreign culture. In what follows, I will discuss each case study by describing their background, participation in the project, and the learning they experienced as a result of the telecollaboration. The first case study, James was a 19-year-old sophomore, and he was chosen to be one of the focal participants due to his unique insights and approach to the project. James was born in the United States into a family with Mexican and Native American heritage. He was born and raised in a large West Coast city and had friends of various ethnic and cultural backgrounds. His everyday experiences growing up were largely different from most of his college classmates because of his ethnic background, as well as the city and the neighborhood he had lived in. For instance, he emphasized having different ways to spend free time, different ways of relating to his parents, and different challenges he had faced. His background and experiences made James highly aware of his own multicultural identity, as well as the importance of learning about other cultures. In particular, he thought it was crucial to understand the reasons behind certain cultural differences, as that would make one more accepting of other people and their actions. All of this suggests a certain degree of intercultural competence prior to the telecollaboration. While James clearly identified as a Mexican American in the pre-project interview, his understanding of his own identity kept shifting. For example, prior to the telecollaboration, he said he was looking forward to directly interacting with somebody from a different culture, and that he hadn't had prior experiences with intercultural communication. In saying that, he apparently disregarded the fact that he had always been interacting and mediating between different cultures as a result of his background. He also continued portraying himself as monocultural during the exchange. In his telecollaboration posts, James seemed to adopt more of a dominant U.S. culture identity, and he later explained that he wanted to highlight the U.S. culture, seemingly equating it with the mainstream narrative. He also mentioned that it was important to him to introduce the culture the right way to his Colombian peers, which shows that he was eager to take on the role of the culture mediator. However, James did not go above the requirements in posts and comments, and said that he assumed more of a role of a distant observer of the interactions between students. He said that it allowed him to view the project from a different perspective and to see a bigger picture, which he thought was helpful to him. In terms of learning from the project, there were 2 main themes for James: self-reflection and the analysis of the U.S. culture. As you can see in this excerpt, James was interested in seeing whether he would identify more with his American peers, the Colombian exchange partners, or both. He was exploring his identity through cultural facts presented and explained by all of the telecollaboration participants. When the posts did follow his predictions, he felt like it was an affirmation for him that he does indeed understand and belong to the culture in question. In his interview, James admitted that he had not expected to think about his cultural identity or learn something about himself through the project, but it ended up being one of the major takeaways for him from the project. James's inquiry into his identity is an example of the potential of telecollaboration to be a personal learning experience. It appears that his background influenced the way he approached the project and the depth of the analysis he performed. However, we cannot attribute this solely to his background or generalize it to other heritage learners. In fact, the other heritage learners in the class did not have the same experience and did not engage in self-reflection on their cultural identity. In addition to self-reflection, another learning experience for James was his engagement in an analysis of the U.S. culture. Interestingly, in that part, he seemed to position himself as a monocultural U.S. American and did not bring his multiple cultural identities into discussion. When talking about differences in cultural practices, James always tried to find reasons for those differences and came up with hypotheses to explain them, which demonstrates his developing critical cultural awareness. It also appeared that the project made him think about culture not just in class, but in his own time. He even continued making cultural observations during the post-project interview. Interestingly, he claimed that he had never thought about American culture as much prior to the telecollaboration. He even admitted that he always assumed that certain preferences and customs pertinent to his culture were in fact universal. Therefore, it appears that it was the telecollaboration that prompted James to develop his intercultural competence and become more culturally aware. He also developed a critical view of his culture, citing excess consumerism and the culture of entitlement as some of the characteristics of the U.S. culture. He admitted that he did not particularly like it and said that he wanted to work on it for himself and be more conscious about it. The analysis of James's interviews and portfolio showed that he engaged in an in-depth cultural analysis where he was able to look at his own culture from both an insider and outsider perspective, thereby putting himself in what Gramsci called the third place. In doing so, James developed some critical cultural awareness as well. He also demonstrated a shift towards a more ethno-relative worldview, where he recognized the validity of cultures and customs different from his own, and even discussed adopting certain features of a foreign culture. Finally, through self-reflection, James connected more with his multiple cultural identities and realized that he could relate to both American and Hispanic cultures. Paul, the second focal participant, was a 21-year-old with an interest in studying Spanish language and culture, although he was in the class to fulfill a language requirement. Paul was raised in the suburbs of a large Midwestern city in what he referred to as a typical white suburban middle-class family. By mentioning the race and the socioeconomic status of his family as indicators of cultural background, Paul demonstrated his awareness of the existence of multiple layers within U.S. culture, which indicates a more thoughtful grasp on the concept of culture from the beginning. Paul was rather critical of the U.S. culture and stated that he did not fully identify with his cultural background, as we see in the quote. He was not sure what culture he did identify with, and said that he belonged to the quote-unquote weird kids group that shared political beliefs as well as interests in skateboarding, writing music, and being different from others. In addition, Paul claimed that he did not like the idea of completely adapting to one culture, which suggests that his view of culture may be more transnational and globally oriented. Interestingly, Paul had never been abroad at the time and did not have much experience in intercultural communication beyond working with Mexicans during the summer, an experience that he thoroughly enjoyed. He even seemed to idealize the Mexican workers while criticizing his U.S. co-workers, but he did not make any differentiation for individuals within those groups. This generalization and romanticization continued in the telecollaboration as well. Paul was open to other cultures and had an ethno-relative worldview that values different perspectives. He was willing to integrate other cultures' practices and question his own culture's values. We can say that Paul already possessed a certain degree of intercultural competence before engaging in the telecollaboration, and participating in the exchange confirmed and solidified his perspectives. Paul was looking forward to the telecollaboration before it started, and he enjoyed participating in it. He valued the experiential learning nature of the project, but mentioned that he would have been more interested to both share his opinions and learn about Colombian students' opinions if the conversation topics had been more profound and had included a political or critical, controversial component. Paul always fulfilled the requirement of making one post per week and read other people's posts, but did not comment very much. His main reason for not commenting more was related to Colombian students' low activity on the interactional part of the project. In particular, Paul complained that when he commented on their posts, he only got likes, but not responses, even when he asked a question in his comments. However, Paul was always very active in weekly class discussions and deemed them one of the most interesting parts of the course. One of the big themes in Paul's learning in the exchange was his persistent romanticizing of the target culture while criticizing the US culture. Even prior to the exchange, Paul tended to idealize Hispanic cultures in general based on the images that he had seen. For instance, he mentioned the beautiful nature found in images of Latin America and admitted that while the US also has places with beautiful and varied landscapes, he didn't view them as favorably. The contrasting continued to take place in Paul's analysis of the two cultures in the project. For example, one of the most surprising things that Paul learned about Colombian culture was the custom of greeting each other with a kiss on the cheek. He suggested that Colombians are closer to each other socially, while Americans want to have, quote-unquote, the biggest bubble for themselves, which he thought represented an entitled culture. Whether this is a correct observation or not, it seems to be a far-reaching conclusion based solely on the custom of greeting. This overgeneralization shows that Paul may have already had a conclusion about the culture that he predetermined to be true, and he used this new knowledge about a custom as an example to support that conclusion. Another example of Paul contrasting the two cultures based on one tradition was his discussion of differences in celebrating Halloween. In this excerpt, Paul suggested that the fact that Colombian students enjoy trick-or-treating with their younger family members is a demonstration of their close relationships with their families. At the same time, Paul painted a rather unfavorable picture of US students and stated that his observation made him sad about his culture, which is a rather strong statement to make based on one holiday celebration. While he exhibited overgeneralizations and idealized target culture, Paul nevertheless further enhanced his existing intercultural competence skills and developed some new ones as well. While some of Paul's attitudes prior to the exchange indicated an ethno-relative worldview, he also had some ethnocentric characteristics, such as considering some US cultural norms and values to be universal. The telecollaboration made him not only realize that other cultures have different practices and values, but also made him willing to incorporate them in his own culture. Another learning for Paul happened when he analyzed his classmates' responses to the prompts. He thought they painted a stereotypical picture of the US and only considered their own Midwestern experiences, while disregarding how certain views and practices may be different in other regions or among other populations in the country. He added that he took everything that Colombians said for the truth, which is why he thought that they would take everything the US students said as the truth as well. But it wasn't representative of the culture as a whole. This is an interesting point, as Paul was trying to put himself in the Colombian students' shoes and predict what they might think about when they read their American peers' posts. Such thinking provides evidence that Paul was moving toward the cultural mediator position, where he could see it both from an insider and outsider perspective. He also demonstrated a complex view of the culture and was able to distinguish the cultural differences within his own culture, which are important components of intercultural competence. Paul was one of the more interculturally competent participants from the beginning of the project, and he still was able to further develop his skills and understanding of both cultures. However, his renouncing and criticizing of his own culture showed that while he had a generally ethno-relative orientation, he also exhibited signs of an ethnocentric stage, and his generalizations about both cultures largely confirmed his existing biases. The third focal participant was Maddie, an 18-year-old freshman pursuing a minor in Spanish. Maddie grew up in a large Midwestern city and described her cultural background as Irish, as you can see in this excerpt. While she demonstrated a strong affiliation with Irish culture and Catholicism, she struggled explaining what it meant to her and only mentioned a few stereotypes. Interestingly, later in the interview, Maddie said that she did not express her Irish identity and culture very much because she did not speak Gaelic, which suggests that she may equate culture with language. Additionally, the idea of cultural perspectives and values was largely absent from Maddie's understanding of culture prior to the project. Maddie had a lot of exposure to different cultures through extensive traveling and claimed to enjoy traveling and learning about how other people live. She also stated that, for the most part, the intercultural communication on her trips was easy because people on both sides wanted to learn more about each other's cultures. However, the examples she gave did not signal a high level of intercultural competence. For example, she described a cultural difference as differences between Thai and American massages, or told a story about unintentionally offending someone by killing a bug and immediately disregarding that person's feelings. All of this shows that, in spite of ample experience and interest in other cultures, Maddie held a rather ethnocentric worldview prior to the telecollaboration. Maddie was interested in telecollaboration and enjoyed participating in it. She did the required number of posts and comments every week, but lamented that she did not get many responses. However, unlike Paul, the main reason she was frustrated about not getting a response was not that she was genuinely curious, but that she had nothing to say in the class discussion afterwards. At the same time, she thought the project and class discussions were very interesting, and it was a better way to learn about culture than what she had typically done in previous language classes. Maddie reported learning a lot about Colombian culture as a result of the exchange, and her portfolio and post-project interview also showed that she experienced a development in her intercultural competence. In particular, she seemed to have moved along the intercultural sensitivity continuum toward a more ethno-relative worldview, and she also demonstrated a development of third place, where she could mediate between the two cultures. However, given her originally ethnocentric perspectives, her intercultural competence did not reach as high of a level as some of her classmates, like James and Paul. According to Maddie, one of the most shocking things she learned was the difference in greetings, and she found it weird to greet people with a kiss on the cheek. She said that the class discussion was helpful in understanding and accepting it as a thing people do, but she would not understand or accept it if an American did that. She did, however, attempt to understand the connection of the customary greetings to cultural perspectives. In particular, she mentioned that Americans keep their own personal space, which is why their greetings are more reserved than those in Colombia. This shows that Maddie moved from the stage where cultural differences are viewed negatively toward a more open view, where one can appreciate these differences and understand that the same practice may have different meanings. It seems that Maddie was trying to understand a practice and accept it as a valid, but she is far from adapting to it or integrating it into her own culture. Another example of Maddie trying to understand the reasons for cultural differences was her discussion of the typical living arrangements in the United States and Colombia. She suggested that the American tradition, moving out of one's parents' house as early as possible, shows their preference for being by themselves and not being willing to interact with other people. While this certainly seems like an overgeneralization and a reach to make sense out of a cultural difference, it also shows that Maddie at least attempted to understand the reasons behind different practices. In the post-project interview, Maddie also demonstrated a development of a third perspective, where she could take on an insider and outsider's view on both home and target culture. One of the examples was her discussion of New Year's celebration. She said that she was surprised to learn about the Colombian tradition of eating 12 grapes on New Year's Eve, and mentioned that she had always thought that New Year was celebrated the same everywhere. She then added that in the United States there is also a tradition of watching the Times Square ball drop, and as she was saying it, she realized that it may seem like an odd tradition to other cultures. Finally, Maddie showed taking on outsider's perspective when discussing some of her classmates' posts. She mentioned several examples where she thought the posts were inappropriate for intercultural communication, as they included jokes that could have been misinterpreted. This shows not only her third-place stance, but also the potential to be a mediator between cultures, where she would recognize culturally determined information and predict potential conflict. Before the telecollaboration, Maddie exhibited a mostly ethnocentric worldview, where she did not recognize cultural differences or did not accept them as valid. The analysis and comparison of her discussions before and after the project demonstrate that participating in the telecollaboration allowed her to move along the intercultural sensitivity continuum and get closer to an ethno-relative position, where she saw other cultures as equally as valid as her own, even when she did not accept certain practices. In addition, Maddie demonstrated a development in her skills as an intercultural mediator as she took on the other culture's perspective and looked at her home culture from both an insider and outsider's perspective. In other words, telecollaboration proved to be an important and effective experience in this participant's intercultural competence development. To summarize, given their different backgrounds, the three participants had different levels of intercultural competence at the beginning of the project, somewhat different approaches to the telecollaboration, and a different amount of growth. More specifically, James and Paul, who exhibited a higher degree of intercultural competence before the project, ended up further on the imagined continuum of intercultural competence development than Maddie, whose intercultural awareness was not as developed to begin with. However, all three participants were able to benefit from the telecollaboration and begin or continue developing their intercultural competence. It was also shown that it is not possible to quantify the level of intercultural competence or the amount of growth that each participant experienced, as they could not be placed into one specific stage of intercultural development. Instead, both before and after the telecollaboration, all three participants exhibited skills and qualities pertaining to different stages of Bennett's intercultural awareness continuum and demonstrated different degrees of Byram's intercultural communicative competence components. This suggests that intercultural competence development is a nonlinear process that cannot be accurately measured at one point in time. Therefore, it is not feasible to expect the same learning outcomes or even the same experiences in an exchange, which in turn makes the question of assessing telecollaboration outcomes a problematic issue for practitioners. On the one hand, if the goal of the telecollaboration is to reach a certain level of intercultural competence, it is necessary to measure whether learners do in fact get to that level. On the other hand, since learners start at different points, it is more logical to assess their growth as opposed to their proficiency. In other words, we cannot establish benchmarks for students to reach in the intercultural competence like we do with other language skills. Instead, I suggest to formally assess telecollaboration, we should consider the degree of learners' participation in the exchange and their analysis of their experiences. Such analysis can be done in a form of a portfolio or a reflection paper. In this manner, educators can assess both the process, participation, and the product, post-project reflection, of telecollaboration without the risk of an unfair assessment. The issues of assessing students' learning also bring the question of assessing intercultural competence as a whole. As Byram suggested, the acquisition of intercultural competence is never complete nor perfect. In addition, as the case studies show, this acquisition is not necessarily linear, as learners may exhibit different stages or different degrees of development of various skills. For that reason, looking at the growth over a period of time may demonstrate a more complete picture of individual intercultural development. This finding also demonstrates that while developmental models of intercultural competence are useful for understanding general guidelines of such development and informally assessing learners' progress, they're not perfect and should not be used as sole indicators of one's intercultural competence. Thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.